Hello, the title of my presentation today is Peer Review and Complex Language Resources. And I'm presenting on behalf of myself, Dr. Richard Griscom, and Dr. Lauren Collister. Together, we've been serving as guest editors at the Journal of Humanities Data on a special collection called the Language Documentation Collections, Assessment, and Recognition. In today's presentation is presented at the Language Documentation and Archiving Conference, whose theme is, where do we go from here? In our work on this special collection, we asked authors to write about peer review for language documentation collections. We know about open review and blind review and double blind or triple blind review processes, but we wanted to facilitate discussion around how peer review and its goals might coexist with various needs of stakeholders in language resource creation and language resource use. One of the things that peer review does is provide a mechanism for the assessment process when scholars are in the job market and they are facing tenure or promotion or hiring boards. So our interest in these issues is strongly motivated and guided by several works and statements that are in the blogosphere or the literature, and these include the major work of the area by Thieberger et al. In 2016, describing the impact of job review on job assessment, promotion, and career advancement in the Australian university situation. And to take a quote from their work, they say, for all researchers, but particularly those in their early and mid-career, this is a formidable price to pay when track record is measured first and foremost in publications, talking about the impact on the availability of primary language resources. Thus, there is at present a strong disincentive for researchers to continue to annotate, curate, and archive their data beyond the minimum required for their current research focus because of the considerable investment of time and effort required. Now, we want to say that worldwide, peer review has different sorts of relationships to the issues of job retention, job acquisition, and workplace advancement. But we also want to say that we wholeheartedly agree that creating complex language resources should be given appropriate weight in hiring, tenure, and promotion discussions. These resources represent a significant amount of career investment and should be valued as such. So we outlined 3 areas in which assessment of archival language collections for these purposes can be further clarified and streamlined. Now, I've been saying complex language resources, and I want to explain what I mean by that term, because I kind of made it up. I mean corpora, which have a design focus to be used in a specific investigation. So they're works of works, they're independent components that could stand alone, that are brought together to be used in a particular way to facilitate asking or answering research questions. Oftentimes, corpora are in the same modality, like all text or all video or all audio. But the crucial component here is twofold, is that they're works of works and that they have a specific design for being brought together. In contrast to them, archival collections have a different thematic design component. Maybe they are event related, such as a collaboration with a community of an endangered language that is collected in a specific research trip. Or maybe they're thematically themed around an individual. For instance, if I were to collect together some of the papers and field notes and speeches of the late Dr. Bob Blust, whose works I appreciate reading. And finally, I want to say that databases are very structured elements and are complex language resources as well, but they have a different focus than even corpora do. So I'm not going to talk much about databases, but I want to acknowledge that these three types of resources is what I consider complex language resources because they have multiple parts to them. In library sciences, we might call these aggregate works. With regards to improving upon the discussion that Thieberger et al. Brought to our attention in 2018, or 2016, pardon me, our points revolve around three of the following things. First, archive versus repository, corpus versus collections, and finally, the valuation of complex resources by comparison with resources which are more widely known and recognized in assessment and recognition processes. To kind of provide some background information, Thieberger et al. Say in a footnote on page 2 that in their paper, they use the more generalized term repository to include archives, such as the specialized linguistic archives discussed in their paper, thus putting archives and repositories into the same category for at least the purposes of their paper, but more broadly now in the purposes of this discussion for assessment and recognition. In this, on page 3, they say, in this paper, we use the term collection and curated corpora interchangeably to mean a particular type of data set, namely annotated corpora of the text data transcribed from recordings that are included as part of the data set. Thus, they bring together the idea of corpus and archival collections into a singular entity. So, are archives and repositories the same thing? I would like to consider some of the characteristics of an archive and contrast those with a repository. Archives are known to grow their collections, to wean their collections, and to reorganize or redescribe their collections. They use terminology such as accession to grow or wean to deaccession, or deaccession to wean, and to reorganize or redescribe as curate. In contrast, repository have a commitment to provide faithful copies of deposits. Archives have a preservation mandate. In contrast, repositories have a persistence mandate. One is to preserve the artifact and the other is to guarantee accessibility. There is certainly some overlap, but the focus is different and drives the operational requirements and how they go about fulfilling their mission, and it becomes very different in operations. Archives, therefore, are very concerned with medium and format transference, whereas repositories were designed to have faithful, immutable deposits. And for some of us, the OAIS model, which was first developed for NASA and their data retention for space exploration projects, they needed a system that would faithfully replicate any of the data that they collected. So the OASIS model was, it was formulated and has become steadfast, a crucial component, a foundational component in repositories all over the world that are now used by many universities and library systems. To more fully understand the difference between archival collections and corpora, I want to appeal to the library sciences. Functional requirements for bibliographic records is a model that librarians and information science uses to distinguish when and what type of records to create about an object or an artifact. So we acknowledge that there's a work, a creative or intellectual component that is then realized through an expression. And a creative work may have multiple expressions. A book may have a movie and a format of written text. A written text, though, may have multiple manifestations. It may be an ebook that's pageless, or it may be in Braille. And then a manifestation may have multiple items, so a couple of copies of the same exact printing of the same exact book. When we look at these kinds of things, we make different kinds of records depending on where they are in that tree. But here's some ways that I highlighted in bold some of the things that linguists are familiar with. So if we have on the left-hand side equivalent in the gray, the original, we might have the same expression but different manifestations if we make a copy, an exact reproduction, a reprint, a scan. We might have a different expression of the same work, which would be a derivative, if we have a translation or a revision. Now, the dotted line in the center is generally where libraries would start to create a new record of the type of a new work and give a general relation to the original work. And that would be where we have a free translation, a review, or even an annotated edition. So these models here help us understand the nature of our work. And so I think it would be beneficial to look at corpus and archival collections partially through this lens, but also understanding the difference in internal relationships between the two. So we agree with Sullivant that there is a distinction between a corpus, annotated or otherwise, and a collection. Now, Sullivant in 2020 gives an example, and he says, such a description of works, talking about Love et al., and he describes how Love and his colleagues put together a corporate of spoken English and describes in great detail the kinds of things in that corpus and how it's organized. And he says, such a description works well for collections like these, but typical language documentation collections differ significantly from highly structured linguistic corpora in two key ways that ought to be reflected in their descriptions: participant identifiability and granularity of data access and reuse. Sullivant goes on further to say, other key differences between corpora and collections is the granularity of data access and reuse. Corpora are generally designed and built to be consulted and reused in aggregate, so as a unit, whereas users are unlikely to listen to, for example, individual telephone switchboard recordings to hear a particular participant's response to a conversation prompt. In contrast, the heterogeneous and opportunistic collected materials of language documentation collections can and are often consulted individually for their content for non-linguistic research. In the library sciences literature, we talk about the types of connections between a unit and inside of a unit. So we have works within works, and linguists should be familiar with an edited volume, as those are individual chapters are often by independent authors, but it's a whole work together in some sense, but it's also many individual works. Whereas other resources might be aggregates that are connected in a different kind of way and not thought of as a single unit, except for the fact that they are managed perhaps in an institutional archive in some with some continuity. So let's take a look at this. For the valuation for the purposes of job retention, promotion, and job acquisition, what is some ways that we can look at these? And one way is a single work versus multiple works. So a single work, we might be familiar with monograph and journal article, and multiple works, we might be familiar with edited volume. So I'm suggesting that corpus versus a collection would fit in this dynamic as well. And so a corpus might be compared with a monograph, and a collection, an archival collection, might be compared with an edited volume. To look at this, then, the presented matrix here would be to evaluate our first two observations as what is being reviewed in an archive and therefore immutable. Like, is it in an archive, and what are the contextual assumptions about how this resource will be managed? Reviewers for peer review need to be aware of that process, and that is a component of how the resource may be structured internally with its component parts. So contrasting the expectations of the context of the preservation of this resource. Perhaps the resource is in a repository and therefore it's immutable. And in the second point then is what is being reviewed. Is it an annotated work of works, or is it a single set of works? So again, the character of the language resource changes between these two things. And so if I were to ask a reviewer to give me a review of some language resource, I would expect to ask different kinds of questions depending on what where it fell in this matrix, this 2x2 grid. Now, how should tenure boards or hiring committees or job retention panels, how should they evaluate these kinds of resources? Well, when they evaluate resources and maybe they give them a score or have a weighting that goes to them, by looking at things as works of works or things as a single work, but many of them, they can apply appropriate measures of weight for their contexts. This gives these sorts of conversations a principled approach. It also gives reviewers a principled approach to assess these types of resources. And then once we have this in place and have I think a broader community understanding about these kinds of resources and the value of their diversity and the makeup of they are, and then we can ask a very important question of how does the peer review contribute to the authority of the work, because the peer review process is going to be different for these kinds of resources. Thank you, and I'm ready to take some questions.